As I start to work with some of the slabs that I've milled and dried, being able to flat them is extremely important. So making a router sled table and doubling as an assembly table was one of the important things to do. In this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the steps that I went through in making what I'm going to call a very sturdy, heavy-duty router sled table. The overall dimensions of the table are 4 feet wide, 12 feet long, and the height of the table ended up being about 37 inches. I plan on using kind of some deck terminology. I don't know if it's exactly the same for table building, but that's what I used in this build. So first thing I did was lay out posts, and there are 8 posts, so 2 sets of posts, and I notched where the beams would go in and a little bit of the bracing on the bottom on the 2 end set of posts. So using a router and a little jig, it was the easiest. I think I set it for maybe 3/4 of an inch, so half of the beam, the 2x6 would find its way notched into the post. You could also use a circular saw and curve cut it and then knock out the kerf, and that would also work for making that notch. Once those were all notched out, I began to assemble. Luckily, I had enough clamps to kind of hold it all together before I add any fasteners. Now here's a great look at just kind of some of the substructure of what's going on. So there's 4 beams, so 2 on each side of posts on each side. And then on top of the beams, I'm going to call them joists. So the joists started lining up across there. 2 on each of the posts, and it worked out that joists in between the posts were about 12 inches off center. So as I mentioned earlier, planning on making this very, very stout. Time to work on the braces down below. Now on each end, that's also where I had notched in on the post, and so that 2x4 bracing could be recessed. And then in the middle, I raised it so there's a little bit of a diagonal bracing to the 2 middle posts. And then on the ends, and yes, if you know me, maybe you don't, but if you do know me, there's a slight bit of overkill. So I took the extra pieces of the Doug fir posts and made those 45 and put those in on each of the end posts. So we really have diagonal bracing in every direction on this build. Once I had all the pieces in place and being held in by the clamps, it was time to start putting some mechanical fasteners. So yes, there will be the bearing load that will be transferred by pieces sitting on top of each other into the notches and down through the post, but then the fasteners are also going to hold everything together and keep them from moving. So I started by using some GRK screws, the 3 1/8 inch screw, and I would do each connection. And then I started adding carriage bolts, and again, overkilling. Each of the joists would be connected to the beams down below by using a RSS GRK 8-inch screw. So each one of those joists have 4 structurally rated screws going down into the beams and the carriage bolts going all the way through. The 245 braces on the ends also had carriage bolts going all the way through. Time to lay out the rest of the joists, and as I mentioned earlier, they're 12 inches off center. And then we would bring in the rim joists, or just the 2x6 that's going around, all the way around the outside down the length, and then adding 2 more joists on the end, which would also be considered rim joists. And each of those would get 2 screws into each other, plus one of the RSS 8-inch, you could call them screws, otherwise they might get referred to as lag bolts, but those are getting lagged and screwed in. Now, one of the reasons I have so many joists is that I'm using this as a slab flattening table, so I did not want any deflection. Now, again, overkill. But as you set a large slab on there and then start running the router sled across there, I didn't want any deflection. I wanted this to stay true as it all gets screwed and put in together. So that got all the way done. And then one of the little things that I like to do with some of my projects is just give it a little detail, and that detail is a little black paint on that rim joist, and it just separates the top from the bottom. Do that throughout the workshop. It's kind of a fun little detail. But got a good look at all of those big lag screws going in on each of the joists, and then the black paint itself. With the substructure all done, it's time to turn our attention to putting the decking or the tabletop on. Now, a couple of the details here. I'm using 4x8 sheets of plywood, a couple different types of plywood. BCX are going to be on the bottom and ACX on the top. So I'm putting 3 layers of plywood down. They'll get glued together, so a total thickness of the tabletop is 2 1/4 inches thick. And that's important because you can kind of see where the plywood extends past on each side all the way around. It cantilevers out 3 inches past where the joist would be, and that's going to allow me to clamp underneath, in and around, all the way around, and that's how the router sled will get attached. But before I started putting any plywood down, I measured out exactly where every joist is going to be, because I did lay out every single screw on the whole top. And I did that because with 3 layers, and all 3 layers were screwed down, and they were screwed down with those same GRK R4 3 1/8 inch screws, and they were 6 inches apart all the way. So yes, by the time we got to the top layer of ACX plywood, we would have 3 screws through the bottom plywood into those joists. So again, heavy built on that side there. I needed to lay those out because I always, if I don't, I'm going to end up hitting the one below. I also want to know where every screw is, and that's why I left all of the chalk lines on there, because if at some point as an assembly table, if I want to drill all the way through and put some shop dogs in here, or table dogs, whatever you want to call them, I'll be able to do that in this situation. I also pre-drilled every hole, because if you've ever used plywood, you know when you put screws in, there's always the chance of puckering up a little piece of the plywood all the way around. So I did do a pre-drill with a little countersink, so each one of those screws was recessed down into the plywood itself. Used Type Bond Premium 2 as the glue, which is also going to act as kind of a sealer. You can get into a whole big discussion on that if you want. And also using ACX and BCX, you know that the X is for exterior. So there was, in essence, a sealing each of the boards from the bottom as they came up to the top, and I only put down a polyurethane on the top of the table, not the bottom. But we'll cover that in just a little bit. But with screws going all the way around, I needed to have enough clamps. I had quite a few of the nice little Irwin clamps to clamp all the way around the top and keep that top ACX piece of plywood in place. And pulling all the clamps off, now it was time to do a little bit of finishing. Decided, yeah, I know it's a little bit of color there, not a big deal, but I sanded all the way around the outside to get a nice smooth surface around the outside. And ACX is already pre-sanded on the top, so this is just a 120 grit on top of the tabletop that I hit it with a 120 just to soften it up a little bit. And then I did do a quarter, not round, but a little chamfer all the way around the tabletop itself, a 45 chamfer, and that's just going to help if you're moving things in and around, just catching that top and peeling it up a little bit, but didn't have to worry about that. Then it was time to put some of that finish down. I used the water-based Varathane polyurethane, which is, since it's not going outside, it's interior, you can use that water-based, but that actually is one of the hardest polyurethanes, and so moving slabs around this table and everything, that's just a great option to use. All right, well, that is pretty much the build for the bottom. I'm going to be doing another follow-up video where I show you how I put the router sled together and got all of that for this table. You can use this table for an assembly table, especially because I'll be able to take off the router sled and store that on the side and use it as assembly. But just this really stout. If I miss something, don't be afraid to leave a comment, ask a question. I tried to cover everything and be a little bit thorough. Do appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. If you made it this far, that's awesome. And you can give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and follow along as we do the next video, which I'm going to be doing. You'll want to check out the router sled itself, because that's actually a pretty cool tool to have into the wood shop. So thanks again for being here. This is Glenn, Workshop at the Gardens, and make sure you check out the video on putting together the whole router sled itself. Pretty cool little tool to have in the workshop. But as you can see, it makes a great assembly table, nice, big, and sturdy for any of the projects that you're going to tackle in a workshop, especially when you're dealing with slab wood. There's a lot of videos about slabbing wood and milling here. But here's the router sled in action. Nice big silver maple getting flattened out on the router sled table. Once again, thanks for following along and watching the video. Glenn here, Workshop at the Gardens. Cheers.